Greetings all, welcome back. You've made it to the end, chapter 12, part 3. We finally begin with Europe's expansion westward. But before we can look to the Americas at all, we must first turn our attention to the Reconquista. The kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula would be in constant conflict during this period and for well over 100 years prior. In Castile, the civil war and incompetent governance would allow the Castilian nobility to gain control over the peasantry and greater independence from the dominant monarchy. In Aragon, the royal government benefited from the commercial influence of Catalonia, but after 1458, Aragon became enmeshed in a civil war that involved both France and Castile. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella allowed them to spend their resources on the creation of Europe's most powerful army, which they then used to conquer the last remaining Islamic principality, Granada, of what had once been Al-Andalus in 1492. And if that date sounds familiar, you know why. The solution to the disputed succession and war lay in the blending of the two royal families. In 1469, Prince Ferdinand of Aragon would be recognized as the undisputed heir to the throne and secured his position by marrying Isabella, the heiress of Castile. Isabella would become queen in 1474, Ferdinand king in 79, but Castile and Aragon would be continued to rule as separate kingdoms until 1714.
Here we have Ferdinand and Isabella honoring the Virgin. In this contemporary Spanish painting, the royal couple are shown with two of their children and two household chaplains, in the company of the Blessed Virgin, the Christ Child, and saints from the Dominican order. The Dominicans were instrumental in conducting the affairs of the Spanish Inquisition. How clear is the distinction between these holy figures and the royal family? What message is conveyed by their proximity?
Christian kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula were devoted to the Reconquista or Reconquest for several centuries. Victory over the Muslims of Granada and the expulsion of Jews in 1492 are the key watershed events that you should be aware of. They would mark the beginning of an initiative to construct a new basis for the United Kingdoms of Aragon and Castile and to transcend revival and regional identity. It will strengthen the emerging nation state by constructing an exclusively Christian identity, attaching that identity to the crown, promoting its own language, that of Castilian Spanish. They will succeed in capturing and redirecting the rhetoric of the Crusade, and just a few months after Ferdinand and Isabella conquered Granada, Queen granted 3 ships to a Genoese adventurer, a little guy you've probably never heard of, who promised to reach India by sailing westward across the Atlantic and claim any new lands he would find for Spain. Columbus, of course, never reached India, but he did help to extend the tradition of the Reconquest and that same crusading ethos to the New World, with some far reaching consequences. Remember, it is because of this crusading ethos we set up Spain as the effective enemy of free peoples.
Now we have Prince Henry the Navigator and the Portuguese colonial initiatives. When the focus of European economic expansion began to shift toward the Atlantic, Portuguese mariners were well placed to take advantage of this trend. The central figure, of course, was Prince Henry from 1394 to 1460, later called the Navigator. He was fascinated by the sciences of cartography and navigation. He helped to ensure that Portuguese sailors had access to the latest charts and navigational instruments. He played an important part in organizing the Portuguese colonization of Madeira, the Canary Islands, and the Azores, and pioneering the Portuguese slave trade. By the 1440s, Portuguese explorers had reached the Cape Verde Islands. In 1444, they landed on the African mainland, the Gold Coast, and began to collect cargoes of gold and slaves. They built a series of forts along the African coastline to intercept trans Saharan caravans. Now let's look at Prince Henry the Navigator. He was inspired by the stories told by Mandeville and Marco Polo, the legend of Prester John, a mythical Christian king whom Europeans believed would be their ally against the Muslims. He became the Grand Master of a new crusading order, the Order of Christ, whose mission was to drive the Muslims out of Africa.
Portuguese attempted to monopolize the entire spice trade, and indeed they will succeed. It will get to a point where the Venetians are actually buying their pepper from the Portuguese, but I digress. In 1488, Portuguese captain Bartolomeu Dias sailed around the southern tip of Africa, later named the Cape of Good Hope by King Iago. Iago? Yeah, Iago?
I don't know Portuguese.
I don't know Portuguese either. Leave your comment. Please correct my grammar. But correct my pronunciation. It'll engage the algorithm. Anyway, 1481 to 95. In 1497 and 98, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape and crossed the Indian Ocean to Calcutta in India. This opened a viable sea route between Europe and the Eastern Spice Trade. He would become a hero and the basis for the Portuguese national epic, the Lusíads. The Portuguese now dominated the spice trade so completely that the Venetians were forced to buy their pepper from the Portuguese capital in Lisbon. See, told you. In 1509, the Portuguese defeated the Ottoman fleet in the Indian Ocean and blockaded the mouth of the Red Sea. In 1509, the Portuguese defeated an Ottoman fleet in the Indian Ocean and blockaded the mouth of the Red Sea. By 1510, the Portuguese had established a series of forts along the western Indian coastline, including their headquarters at Goa. In 1511, Portuguese ships seized Malacca, and in 1515, they had reached the Spice Islands and the coast of China.
Now we have the naval technology and navigation. By 1500, larger caravels of about 200 tons, with a third mast and a combination of square and lateen sails. A lateen sail is a triangular sail, much easier to use going against the wind. There were new map making techniques. Quadrants could calculate latitude in the northern hemisphere by the height of the North Star above the horizon. We have astrolabes and compasses. There were standard tables for the calculation of latitude, maps, and navigational charts. There were books known as rutters or routiers, which contained detailed sailing instructions and descriptions of the coastal landmarks. The Portuguese caravel was based on designs that fishermen had used since the 13th century. In the 1440s, Portuguese shipwrights began building larger caravels of about 50 tons displacement and equipped with two masts, each carrying a triangular lateen sail, and these ships required much smaller crews than did multi-oared galleys. During the 15th century, map-making techniques extended to the Atlantic Ocean. By 1600, the accumulated knowledge contained in rutters spanned the globe.
Larger ships and improved navigational aids made it possible for the Portuguese and other European mariners to reach Africa, Asia, and the Americas if you couldn't have surmised. The most critical military advance is the increasing sophistication in artillery, though. Gunpowder and improved metallurgical techniques would be essential for casting cannon barrels, and yet even then some will explode in their faces quite fantastically. The Portuguese would gain control of the Indian Ocean in 1509 when they defeat the combined Ottoman Indian naval forces. Portuguese trading outposts in Africa and Asia will be fortifications to ward off the assaults by other Europeans.
Caravels and heavier galleons became important because a larger size made it possible to mount more artillery pieces. It also increased the speed of a vessel. A wind powered vessel is faster if it has a longer length. European vessels were now floating artillery platforms with guns mounted in fixed positions along sides and swivel guns mounted fore and aft. Guns in ships were expensive, but for rulers who could afford them, such ships made it possible to back mercantile ventures with military power. Here we have the Spanish galleon, the larger full bottom ships that came into use during the 15th century became engines of imperial conquest and the vessels that brought the riches of those conquests back to Europe. This wooden model was made for the Museo Storico Navale di Vicenza. Sorry, my say again.
It's okay.
Mucho,
You didn't do any worse than I would have.
Museo Storico Navale di Venezia, the Naval History Museum in Venice, Italy.
On to a topic which I'm sure you're not going to be surprised by: the development of a new kind of slavery. The new slavery of the late 15th century was mostly due to its increasing racialization. West African slaves viable in ways that other slaves were not. There's this new ideology which would begin to emphasize racial inferiority. Lisbon would become a market for enslaved Africans during Prince Henry's lifetime. Around 15 to 20,000 African captives would be sold within a 20-year period. By about 1505, the numbers will amount to some 150,000. Purchasers of these enslaved individuals regarded them as status symbols. It would become fashionable to have African footmen, page boys, even ladies' maids. Slavery disappeared in northwestern Europe by the mid 12th century, but continued in parts of the Mediterranean world on a small scale. The only major slave economy at this point was the Ottoman Empire. Slaves ran the bureaucracy, staffed the army, etc. See our previous video on the Ottomans.
Now we have a new kind of slave based sugar plantation, which began to emerge in Portugal's Atlantic colonies in the 1460s, starting at the Cape Verde Islands. The islands weren't populated and climate discouraged Europeans from living there. Located along the routes of slave traders venturing into the nearby West African coast. The plantation model would be exported to Brazil by the Portuguese and to the Caribbean by the Spanish. Sugarcane plantations in Hispaniola were modeled on those of the Cape Verde Islands. Colonists began to import thousands of West African slaves to labor in the new industry. There was a need to import slave labor, which added to its cost. Control over the industry would fall into the hands of a few extremely wealthy planters and financiers.
Christopher Columbus, remember him, 1451 to 1506? He understood that the world was a sphere, but thought it was much smaller than it really was. Columbus's decision to reach Asia by sailing west seemed more plausible after the discovery of the Canary Islands and the Azores. The hypothesis was that the Atlantic was dotted with smaller islands all the way to Japan, or basically modern Japan today. It emboldened Columbus's patrons, Ferdinand and Isabella, who thought he could reach China in about a month. When Columbus reached the Bahamas and the island of Hispaniola after a month's sailing, He reported that he had reached the outer islands of Central Asia, right? His destination. Columbus was not the first European in the Americas. Vikings, as in Leif Erikson, had been somewhere between Labrador and possibly New England around the year 1000. He did not return with spices, but brought some samples of gold and a few indigenous people whom he kidnapped. Their existence gave the promise of tribes that could be converted to Christianity and lands that could provide opportunities for Spanish settlers seeking new frontiers after the Reconquista. This was a sufficient incentive for the monarchs to finance 3 more expeditions by Columbus and many more by other adventurers, missionaries, and colonists. Now, Columbus himself would never actually reach China, but he will kind of die thinking that he has on his third voyage. These initial interactions between Europeans and the American peoples ultimately begin with trading, very soon devolve into kidnapping with small outbreaks of violence, and a continual search for gold, which will ultimately lead to oppression, enslavement, and above all else, mass genocide via disease. Whether intended or not, disease will be the primary killer of native peoples in Spanish and other European interactions over the centuries to come. But I digress.
Here we have overseas exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. What were the major routes taken by European explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries? What appear to have been the explorers' main goals? How might the establishment of outposts in Africa, the Americas, and the East Indies have radically altered the balance of power in the Old World, and why?
Portuguese rushed to establish their own claim. The Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, sought to demarcate Spanish and Portuguese possession of the as yet undiscovered lands. Among the first to champion the existence of 2 new continents was the Italian geographer Amerigo Vespucci, 1454 to 1512. Europeans gradually reached the conclusion that the voyages of Columbus and his successors revealed an entirely new world not foretold by Christianity or the classical thinkers. The realization that the Americas are not an outpost of Asia would come as a pretty big disappointment since they did not reach the Spice Islands. In 1513, the Spanish Vasco Nunez de Balboa, in other words, Vasco Balboa, viewed the Pacific Ocean from the Isthmus of Panama.
Now let's look at Ferdinand Magellan. The new monarch, Charles V, 1500 to 1556, accepted Ferdinand Magellan's proposal to see whether a route to Asia could be found by sailing around South America. Magellan's voyage circumnavigated the globe, but destroyed plans for an easy southwest passage to Asia, though the dream of a northwest passage motivated many Europeans.
Ultimately, the dream of gold will, in some ways, lead to the downfall of empires. Within a generation after Columbus's first ships landed, European diseases spread rapidly among indigenous people. Diseases, especially those of measles and smallpox, are not fatal to the Europeans, but were amazingly fatal to the native peoples living in the Americas. They will end up killing some 250,000 or more of those living on Hispaniola, as an example. Within 30 years, 70% of the native population will be dead from disease. Europeans are very quick to capitalize on the sources of wealth in the New World, all of them. These would include gold, which is what Columbus was offering and looking for, but silver will be the chief takeaway from the New World.
Now, waves of conquistadores, assisted by the complex political, economic, and military rivalries that existed among the societies they encountered. We have the Aztec Empire of Mexico, which rivaled any European state in power, culture, and wealth. It had subsumed many neighboring territories in the course of its conquests. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, amazed Europeans who were impressed by the height and grandeur of its buildings and the splendor of its public works. It reflected the Aztecs' imperial might, which was resisted by the peoples from whom they demanded tribute.
Here we have one of the only surviving depictions of the Aztec city of Tenochtitlan. The Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz de Castillo, 1492 to 1585, took part in Hernan Cortez's conquest of the Aztec Empire and later wrote an account of his adventures. His admiring description of the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, records that the Spaniards were amazed to see such a huge city built in the midst of this vast lake, with gigantic buildings arranged in a meticulous urban plan around a central square, broad causeways linking the city to the mainland. This hand-colored woodcut was included in an early edition of Cortez's letters to Emperor Charles V, printed in Nuremberg, Germany in 1524.
Hernan Cortez, 1485 to 1547, arrived in Hispaniola as a young man on a land grant and acted as magistrate for one of the first towns established there. In 1519, he headed an expedition to the mainland. When Cortez arrived on the coast of the Aztec realm, he formed a relationship with a native woman known as La Malinche, who became his consort and interpreter. He discovered that some people subjugated by the Aztecs were rebellious, and he formed alliances with their leader. Cortez himself only had a few hundred men. He had superior weapons, guns, and horses, but gunpowder was problematic in humid conditions.
Cortez adopted the tactics and weaponry of his native allies in dealing with the Aztec king Montezuma II, 1502 to 20, and in his assaults on Tenochtitlan. It was European bacteria, not technology, that led to his victory. The Aztecs were devastated by an outbreak of plague that arrived with Cortez and his men. In 1521, the Aztec capital fell. Here's a depiction of the conquistadors in Mexico. This 16th century drawing of the conquistadors slaughtering the Aztec aristocracy emphasizes the advantages their plate armor and steel swords gave the Spanish.
In 1533, another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, would manage to topple the centralized empire of the Incas, based in what is now Peru, by similar voluntary and involuntary means. He took advantage of an ongoing civil war that had weakened the reigning dynasty. He was also assisted by an epidemic of smallpox. Like Cortez, Pizarro promised his native allies liberation from an oppressive regime. The conquests of Mexico and Peru gave the conquistadors access to hordes of gold and silver that Aztecs and Incas had accumulated for centuries.
Spanish crown launched a search for the sources of these precious metals. The first gold deposits are discovered in Hispaniola, where surface mines were speedily established using native laborers who were already dying in large numbers from disease and were now further decimated by brutality and overwork. Population will dwindle further to a mere 10% of the pre-Columbian strength. This loss of workers made the mines of Hispaniola uneconomical, so European colonists would turn to cattle raising and sugar production. Surprisingly, they just didn't bring in slaves to get to the work. But we aren't quite there yet. Mining will ultimately shape Spanish colonies most fundamentally. Although gold would inspire the conquest, silver, as I mentioned, is the most lucrative export. Remember, the European economy is a silver-based economy, not a gold one. The Spanish crown will take steps to assume direct control over all colonial exports. The massive infusion of New World silver ended Europe's silver shortage.
But the infusion of silver into Europeans created new problems. It accelerated inflation. Inflation began in the late 15th century, driven by the renewed growth of the European population, an expanding economy, and a fixed supply of food. The influx of New World silver vastly increased supply of coinage, leading to the doubling and quadrupling of prices in the 16th century and the collapse of an inflated economy, driving a wave of impoverished Europeans to settle in the New World in greater numbers.
And that is it. We end our course with the hyperinflation of the Spanish economy. Why? Because it is after this that the world changes fundamentally far beyond the scope of the medieval or even the Renaissance, and we enter the imperial period and then kind of the early modern period, and we'll go on from there. While I know this course has glossed over much, as an example, my beloved Danelaw, the revolutions in England, and so very much more, I do hope it was at least of some help to you, and at least those in my history class. So, if it has been of any help, like, share, subscribe, show my channel to a friend, and now, blessedly, I can go back to producing not just historical content, but also academic, disability, and of course, gaming content. So I will put the series to rest. Thank you. Thank you to my co host, and thank God it's all over.